Chapter 1 Introduction A Gentle Beginning. Hello friends. Welcome to my channel. You've probably heard of ancient Rome. Maybe you know it was great, or maybe you've only heard about its dirty side. Either way, if you want to understand the rest of its story, we have to start from somewhere. So let's start soft. Let's begin with a little sleep. The year is 713 BCE, the place, central Italy. Our scene, a clearing in the woods. A fire crackles, casting flickering shadows around a group of men who huddle close. Their breath hangs in the night air as they tell stories, play games, and argue about things that matter. Like how many gods there are and which one should get all the sacrifices. It's been a long journey, full of peril and hardship, but the worst is behind them. They're safe here in their new home, and by now, their numbers have grown so large that they even boast 1,000 warriors ready to fight alongside their king. But who was this king? Where did he come from? What will become of his people? These questions have plagued historians for thousands of years, but I think I can help clear up some confusion. This king's name was Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. You might have heard of him. He's the guy who killed his twin brother Remus, after the two of them fought over whose turn it was to suckle on a she-wolf. Yes, that story is definitely true, I swear. Anyway, when Romulus died, 7 more kings would rule over Rome before it became a republic. 7 kings who all came from far away in the mysterious land of Alba Longa, ruling like divine princes until they kicked the bucket and were replaced by their heirs. Or at least that's what tradition says. Problem is, we don't have much evidence for any of that, especially not for Romulus. Most scholars agreed that he was a legendary figure whose story was crafted to legitimize the Julio-Claudian dynasty. A family of kings who seized power around the middle of the 6th century BCE, but just where they came from or how they got to Italy is a complete mystery. Even worse, every single shred of evidence for Rome's earliest kings comes from written sources compiled hundreds of years after they supposedly lived, so we have no idea if the traditional list of names and dates is accurate. In fact, given how suspiciously neat and tidy the list looks, many historians suspect that it was concocted retroactively to fit a political agenda. Not that they could come up with anything better. After all, they weren't archaeologists. For most of human history, trying to reconstruct pre-literate societies is nearly impossible. If we can't find any physical evidence, then we're completely at the mercy of whatever written sources happen to survive. And when it comes to Rome, none have survived from before the 2nd century BC. So what do? Well, why not throw out the official narrative entirely and instead tell our own story? A story about an actual king named Numa Pompilius. Numa, son of Pomponius, and king of the Albans, that's right. No Romulus, no Remus, no mythical she-wolves. Just a young king trying to tame a young city. Now, imagine Rome after Romulus. The city's less than a century old, having grown rapidly thanks to waves of new arrivals fleeing a collapsing civilization. Now, those newcomers aren't necessarily ambitious, but they're certainly restless. Many have skills that they'd like to put to use. Others simply seek a piece of the action. Whatever their motivations, Rome feels dangerously unstable. Rival factions vie for influence, while throughout the countryside, other Italian peoples dream of conquest. Numa, remember, is a king in name only. The real power rests with Rome's elders, a council of respected citizens who guide the city through every decision. But even they're stretched thin. They need help. Someone to restore order, bring stability, and show everyone what Rome can be. So they look for guidance from the Oracle of Delphi. And the gods tell them exactly who they're looking for. A shepherd king named Numa Pompilius. Numa was born in the Sabine town of Asculum, a peaceful village nestled in the hills north of Rome. His father, Pomponius, is a local chieftain, but he's not interested in politics. All he wants is for his son to lead the family back to their Sabine homeland. And despite his regal destiny, Numa spends his days tending sheep and enjoying nature. He's quiet and contemplative by nature, but he's also brave, quick-witted, and charming. In fact, he's such a good shepherd that the other shepherds elect him as their leader. When word reaches Rome, the elders send a delegation to Asculum to bring Numa home, but when they arrive, they find that he's gone. Unbeknownst to them, Numa has taken a trip to Delphi to consult the oracle himself. Naturally, he's shocked when the Pythia tells him that he's destined to be king of Rome, but Numa is no fool. He knows that his destiny lies in Rome, not in the Sabine hills, so without wasting any time, he turns around and heads south. He arrives in Rome during a festival dedicated to the god Pan, and the entire city is turned upside down. Butcher shops sell pork, Street vendors peddle wine, and musicians fill the streets with lively tunes. Numa, however, is unimpressed. He finds Rome rude, unrefined, and barbaric. Where are the temples, the statues and paintings, the music, the poetry, the books? Instead, he finds noise, dirt, and debauchery. So when the revelers spot him standing quietly by himself, they figure that he's drunk and beat him up. But soon enough, the dust settles and the Romans cool off. Then they finally notice who they've just attacked, the new king. And suddenly they're very sorry. Numa, though, doesn't hold a grudge. In fact, he's quite happy to see how energetic and passionate the Romans are. He understands that they need an outlet for all that energy, and he finds plenty of ways to support their interests. He hosts festivals and athletic competitions, opens libraries, and builds the first stone temple in Rome. He organizes the priesthoods, establishes the Vestal Virgins, and creates the Senate, a council of elder statesmen that'll eventually run the Roman world. And that's why Rome never forgets Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, the one who brought peace, spirituality, and order to the eternal city. Because for Romans, the greatest virtue is piety. And no Roman was more pious than Numa. Thanks for watching. Remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And as always, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Chapter 2, Rome after Romulus. A kingdom in transition. The year is 713 BCE, and the city of Rome has been without a king for 6 months now. We know from tradition that Romulus, the first king of the Romans, died by getting killed in a fight with his twin brother Remus over who gets to rule their new settlement. But beyond that, there are no written records detailing what happened next, and Livy's account of early Rome is frustratingly vague, telling us that after Romulus was buried in a grand ceremony, there were elections held, and then the Romans proclaimed a new king named Numa Pompilius. So we have to use our imaginations a little bit here to try to fill in the blanks and figure out how Rome went from having one king to another. Alright, so let's get into it. Now, if you remember from the last episode, things didn't exactly go smoothly during the founding of Rome. Even though Romulus and Remus managed to defeat the Sabines in war and absorb their territory into the city, the two brothers had trouble keeping the peace within Rome itself, because although the majority of the inhabitants were of Latin stock, there was also a significant number of Romans, Sabines, and others mixed in there too, and each group had its own customs, culture, and way of doing things. So keeping everyone happy all the time was a real challenge. And even though Romulus came up with some clever solutions to help mitigate these cultural clashes, like when he created the Roman Senate by inviting representatives from every tribe to serve in it, he still couldn't stop the feuding completely. There was always tension between the different groups, and that caused strife within the city. And this wasn't a situation that the Romans wanted to continue after Romulus's death. They knew that without a strong leader to keep the peace, the city could descend into chaos and civil war, and they didn't want that to happen. Unfortunately, though, they were unsure who should lead them because Romulus and Remus were the only royal brothers in the traditional list of kings. There were no sons or other close relatives to step in and take over. So the Romans needed to find a new king. But where do you even start a search like that? Well, the answer actually comes from outside Rome. See, while the city was in the middle of mourning their king and trying to figure out what to do next, word got back to the neighboring Etruscans that Rome was looking for a new monarch, and they thought it would be a great opportunity to place one of their own on the throne. The Etruscans had been eyeing Rome suspiciously since the twins had conquered the region, and with the kingdom leaderless, they saw their chance to intervene and install a puppet ruler. Now, this didn't set off any alarms inside Rome. In fact, the idea of having an Etruscan king was pretty appealing because even though there was a lot of tension among the different tribes within the city, at least everyone agreed on one thing: they didn't like the Etruscans, so having one of them as king would be a good way to keep the peace. Rome was still reeling from the recent wars, and the citizens didn't have much interest in going to war again anytime soon. So it seemed like a good idea at the time. Only problem was, the Senate wanted to make this decision democratically. They didn't want to just hand the crown over to a foreigner without consulting the citizens, so they decided to hold an assembly to decide whether or not to accept an Etruscan king. To no one's surprise, the answer was no. The Romans didn't trust the Etruscans, and that was clear. But the question then became, who should they turn to instead? They needed someone who could unite the Romans, Sabines, and Latins under one banner, someone who could put aside the differences between the tribes and focus on what mattered most: maintaining order and defending the city. Now, the Senate had a lot of suggestions, but none of them were perfect. There was a man named Tarquinius Priscus who was half Etruscan, half Latin, who had experience ruling as the king of the Etruscans. He might have been able to unite the factions, but he was also considered too ambitious and power-hungry to be trusted. There was another candidate named Victus, who was a war hero and very popular among the people, but he was also old and had no experience leading a kingdom. And then there was a guy named Cluilius, who was a senator and considered to be very wise, but he was seen as too soft of a character to maintain order and protect the city. Each candidate had their strengths and weaknesses, and the Senate couldn't come to an agreement on who to choose. So they decided to bring in a mediator, someone neutral who could look at the situation objectively and tell them what to do. And that's when they turned to a man named Numa Pompilius. Now you might recognize that name because in Livy's account of early Rome, Numa is the second king of Rome. But back in this time period before he was king, he was simply a senator from the Sabine tribe. He was well respected by both the Romans and the Sabines, because of his ability to see both sides of an argument and find common ground. So it made sense that the Senate would turn to him to help settle their dispute. Numa listened to their concerns and gave it a lot of thought. He wanted to help, but he also didn't want to overstep his authority as a senator. Finally, he decided to share his thoughts with the assembly. He told them that he understood their concerns and that he knew how important it was to have a strong leader. But he also reminded them that Rome was built on the foundation of democracy, and that the will of the people was more important than the desires of the elite. Numa suggested that instead of bending to the will of outsiders, the Romans should look within their own ranks for a solution. He pointed out that there were plenty of qualified candidates who could lead Rome into the future. It just depended on whether the people were willing to look past their differences and see the potential in each other. He challenged the citizens to look beyond their tribal affiliations and consider what was best for the city as a whole. Numa argued that Rome was at a crossroads, and that the decisions they made now would have ripple effects for generations to come. If they chose to unite and embrace diversity, Rome would become a beacon of democracy and inclusion for the entire Mediterranean. On the other hand, if they chose to fracture and turn inward, Rome would become a shadow of its former self, fractured and divided. In the end, the Romans took Numa's advice to heart and they elected him king. The people were tired of the fighting and they wanted to move forward. They saw in Numa a chance to start fresh and build a better Rome. For the next 42 years, Numa served as a symbol of unity and peace. He reached out to the other tribes and appointed them to influential positions, and he worked hard to build bridges and foster understanding. Under his leadership, Rome became a powerhouse in central Italy, and the other tribes flourished under his protection. Now, to be fair, the details of Numa's reign are mostly legendary, and most historians agree that the story of his kingship was largely a myth created to highlight the wisdom of the Sabine people. But the point is that the Romans recognized that they needed someone to unite the city, and even though it took them a while to find, they eventually landed on a leader who could guide them towards greatness. As for what happens next, I don't know. Like I said, the details are murky at best. But the good news is that if you want to find out what happens next, you won't have to wait long because next week we'll be covering Chapter 3, which will pick up right here and explore how Rome evolved from a small village into a major city under the reign of King Numa. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so you don't miss out on future episodes. Special thanks to my patrons who make these videos possible. If you want to learn more about how you can support the channel, you can check the links down below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Alright, welcome to Chapter 3 of our series, where we look at the early lives of the first 7 kings of Rome. Last time we talked about how Romulus killed Remus and became the first king of Rome, and now it's time to look at his successor Numa Pompilius. We get most of our information from Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, so we'll be looking at those two today. So, Chapter 3 is all about Numa and his rise to power, so let's get into it. Numa was born in the Sabine town of Cures, which was definitely a quieter place than Rome. It was several miles north of the Tiber River, near modern-day Capenna. Now, the Sabines were known for being wise and studious people who loved the simple life, and they weren't interested in getting involved in politics. That was a relief for Numa, because he wasn't interested in politics either. His father's name was Numata, and he was a small landowner. And even though Numa had a younger brother named Romulus who would become king after Numa, his father never expected him to take over the farm. He didn't have that kind of confidence in Numa, you see. Numa was just this very modest kid who was really into philosophy, religion, and the study of law. He was also really friendly with the local herders, farmers, and laborers, but he wasn't interested in becoming the boss. Now, his mother was called Tatia, and she was the daughter of a previous Sabine king. so the royal bloodline went back a bit through her. But for most of Roman tradition, it was his father's side that mattered more, and since his father was just a simple landowner, Numa wasn't really treated like royalty growing up. Now, there was one big exception to that. You see, when he was still pretty young, a group of ambassadors from Rome came to his house to ask his father to marry his daughter, Tatia, off to the recently crowned King Romulus. Of course, this was an enormous honor, and it was almost certainly done to cement the alliance between Rome and the Sabines. The Romans considered themselves to be the dominant partner in the relationship, and while the Sabines might have had some powerful allies in other Italian tribes, they knew that they needed the Romans as much as the Romans needed them. The wedding must have been pretty lavish, since we're told that every Sabine girl wore a silver veil and wreath during the ceremony. But beyond the veils and the wreaths, it must have been a little awkward since the bride and groom weren't exactly head over heels for each other. But that's okay, because we're told that they ended up having a really great relationship. Once they got married, Romulus brought Titia back to Rome where she gave birth to Romulus's son, and then she died. After that, Romulus took young Romulus to live with his grandparents in the Sabine countryside, where he would stay until his own father died and he inherited the throne. Meanwhile, Numa returned to Cures as well, where he spent the next few years living a peaceful life. He mostly kept to himself, but he would sometimes travel around Italy to learn from other philosophers and religious experts. He was especially fond of visiting the nearby town of Ardea, where he befriended a local priestess named Egeria. She was a really powerful woman who specialized in magic and the art of prophecy. She mentored Numa for many years, teaching him everything she knew, and he was a really eager student. In fact, Numa was basically the perfect student. He was super smart, and he asked great questions, and on top of that, he was a really nice guy. I mean, honestly, he couldn't have been a nicer guy. He always tried to make everyone around him happy, and the gods rewarded that attitude. He was incredibly lucky, and none of his ventures ever failed. And that brings us to the most important thing that happened during Numa's youth. He met the god Janus. Now, we don't know much about this encounter. In fact, the only detailed version comes from Plutarch, and he puts it at the very end of Numa's youth. Apparently, Numa was out hunting one day when he came across a clearing full of fruit trees, and he thought to himself, wow, this place sure would be nice to build a temple to all the gods here. Then the ground started shaking and a giant appeared before him with two faces, one on the front and one on the back of his head. And the giant introduced himself as the god Janus, and he said that he chose Numa to be his priest. This meant that Numa was officially sanctioned by the gods to be a religious leader, and that added a lot of prestige to his position. To celebrate, they all went back to Rome together and held a festival called Ianuaria, which honored the god Janus and celebrated the beginning of the new year. And that's where the tradition of making wishes for the new year comes from. Anyway, after the festival, the giant disappeared, leaving Numa to continue on with his regular life. But now he was basically destined to become a religious leader. Romulus wanted that position, but he wasn't smart enough to get it. I mean, don't get me wrong, he was smart enough to get a lower-level priesthood, but the higher-level stuff required charisma and intelligence, not to mention piety and divine favor, and Romulus lacked all of those things. On top of that, he was jealous of Numa's relationship with their father. Numitor had always preferred Numa over Romulus, even though Romulus was the older brother, and that made Romulus even more resentful of Numa. But anyway, long story short, when Numa was still a teenager, Romulus convinced their father to send him to live in Rome with his grandparents. Then, as soon as Numa arrived in Rome, Romulus started spreading rumors about how ungrateful Numa was for wanting to abandon his family in Cures for a bunch of strangers in Rome. And somehow these rumors actually worked. The Romans were really angry at Numa, so much so that they wanted to put him to death. Now, fortunately for Numa, his wife Titia was able to calm everyone down. She reminded the Romans that the reason her father had agreed to marry her off to Romulus was to cement an alliance with the Sabines. So killing her cousin Numa would be like stabbing her father and grandfather in the back, and by extension, stabbing Rome in the back. That made a lot of sense to the Romans, so they backed down and let Numa go. And after that, he went back to Sabina to live a quiet life. We're told that he spent his time writing books and holding philosophical discussions. He also developed a system of weights and measures and created new tools for farming and metalworking. In other words, he was basically the patron saint of craftsmen. Anyway, after spending about 10 years in Sabine, Numa heard that his father-in-law Romulus had died and that young Romulus had taken the throne as Romulus II. Soon after that, some ambassadors from Rome showed up in Sabine to invite Numa to come to Rome and be the new king. Now, it's possible that they actually wanted him to be king, but it's also possible that they were just trying to flatter him into accepting a lower position as a religious leader. Either way, when Numa heard their request, he was terrified. He didn't want to be king, he wanted to be a philosopher. But again, he couldn't say no, because that would have been rude and disrespectful to the Romans. So instead, he pretended to be too busy to go right away, but he eventually caved and traveled to Rome to become the second king of Rome. Now, if you'd like to hear about what he did during his reign, please subscribe if you have already, and leave a comment telling me your favorite part of the story so far. When life is good, we love to tell ourselves that God is good, but when hard times come, when storms hit, we tend to forget. We ask, where is God? Why has he left me? Has he forgotten to be gracious? Habakkuk cried out to God about judgment overtaking his people, and in response, God said, I will stand firm on my watch and station myself on the ramparts and wait to see what he will say to me. Then the Lord replied, write down plainly on tablets of clay and make an inscription on stone with a diamond tip, so that it may be read clearly for years to come. Habakkuk 2:1-2. It seems God was saying, write down what you see happening. Describe what you are going through. He wanted him to record it so he wouldn't forget God's goodness. What does this mean for you today? How do you record your experiences so you won't forget who God is? I want to share a few things with you that I believe will help you not to forget God's goodness. No. 1. When you go through hardships, it tests your ability to trust God. Psalm chapter 37, verse 24. Though the Lord gives a man like thorns, yet he does not withdraw his hand, nor does he have compassion for the travail of his soul. If you read the verses before and after this one, you would realize that David talks about evil men and how they are destroyed. You know, sometimes when we're going through hard times, we start questioning why we're going through them, and if we don't get an answer, or if we feel like the answer is taking too long, we begin to doubt God's presence, care, or involvement in our lives. Do you remember Joseph being sold into slavery by his own brothers? Imagine his shock, his hurt, his disappointment and anger as he looked at the men who had brought him there. It must have been a time where he questioned everything, including God's goodness. Yet God didn't just work through that situation. He turned it around and made it a blessing for Joseph and even for the whole nation of Israel. Romans chapter 8 verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. So when you're facing hardships, remind yourself, this is a test. This is to see if you really believe God is good. No. 2. Feelings of abandonment hinder you from trusting God. 2 Kings 6, verse 21. And Elisha was greatly displeased because they had said, the mountain is here, and the Lord is not here. Now, it happened at that time that Numa, the Syrian commander, went to Israel to seek Elisha and said, as one of God's prophets, I implore you, please help me, for my master, King Aram says, see, many of my lords, the Syrians, have become leprous, as indeed leprosy has never been seen in the land of Aram. And now I am told that he who heals leprosy is in Israel. Well, when Elisha heard this, he said, go to such and such place and dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times. Your leprosy will be healed. But I said, if the Lord is God, I will not take it at your hand. When Elisha insisted, Nahum did not do it. Rather, he said, I will not dip myself in the Jordan. What if the Jordan River itself cleanses me of this disease? I will cleanse myself in the river of Damascus. He turned away and went back. So, in other words, Nehemiah said, if the God of Abraham is the true God, then he should heal me without even me having to dip in the river. Otherwise, the river doesn't cleanse me. Only the God of Israel can cleanse me. Remember, we're not in this alone. God is with us. No. 3. When you seek human solutions, it makes it more difficult to trust God. Acts 16 verse 6. Now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. So when Paul and his companions were directed by the Holy Spirit to preach in certain areas, but they ignored it and decided to go somewhere else, they faced opposition. In Asia, trouble found them. Someone wrote, whenever you choose the easy instead of the right, you will be right where you ought not to be. We may think we know better than God, we may think God's timing isn't correct, or we may think that we can achieve our goal faster if we just disregard God's guidance and voice. We may end up in places we shouldn't be, experiencing things we could have avoided. Number 4. When you acknowledge your weaknesses, it helps you to trust God's strength. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. When Paul boasted in his weakness, he wasn't boasting in his inability. Rather, he was boasting in his dependence on God's strength. The Apostle Paul experienced great persecution. Let's look at 2 Corinthians, chapter 11, verse 23. In fact, I have worked harder than any of them, though not I, but the grace of God which was with me, made me strong. Paul was saying, I worked hard, but it wasn't my strength. It was God's strength that empowered me. So acknowledge your weaknesses so that you can rely on God's strength. Don't try to fix it all yourself. Don't try to fight all your battles on your own. Put your hand in God's hand. Allow Him to lead you. No. 5. When you're certain about decisions, you feel in control. Isaiah 46, 5, 6. My people are being destroyed from a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will reject you so that you will no longer be a nation in my sight. Thus says the Lord, if I have not established day and night as the eternal order of heaven, then your offspring will surely cease to be the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for I will restore their fortunes and have mercy on them. In this passage, God was speaking about his judgment against the people of Israel, and in verse 5, he says, you are being destroyed because of a lack of knowledge. Look at how verse 6 begins, thus says the Lord. That means these people thought they knew what God was saying. They thought they knew his will, but they didn't. There is a story of a man who planted a fig tree by the road, and every year he would come to check on its growth, pull weeds around it, and prune off excess branches. One day he came and saw that it had grown quite tall and spread over the road. He was upset because the tree was growing in the wrong direction. So he started cutting off all the branches that grew toward the road. Well, this man was so focused on controlling the tree that he failed to notice that he had cut off all the branches that produced figs. By the end of the season, he realized that he had killed the very thing he was trying to preserve. Sometimes we try to exert our will on people or situations, but in doing so we may actually kill what God wants to grow. No. 6. When you desire to be in control, it can warp your view of seeking God's will. 1 Chronicles 13 verse 1. So King David was encouraged to take a census of Israel. He said, Go number Israel from Beersheba to Dan, that I may know the number of all the people. But David was sorry when he had taken the census. For the Lord had said, Do not do this thing, for many people will be lost among you. David was sorry because he tried to be in control. He wanted to know exactly how many soldiers he had, and he wanted to know exactly what he had to work with. Instead of relying on God's promise and power, he took matters into his own hands. So David took a census of Israel, which led to 70,000 men being lost to death. 70,000. Can you imagine the loss and impact this would have on Israel? Please remember this. God still sits on the throne. He still knows what's best. Number 7. When you're uncertain about the outcome, it can cause you to do things for the wrong reasons. And ultimately, He is in control, not us. John chapter 6 verses 25 to 27. When Jesus learned that they had crossed over, He called out to them, Didn't you have enough of the miraculous signs? Didn't you have enough fish to eat? But they replied, Yes, we want to perform God's miraculous signs, not just to eat bread and be filled. Jesus replied, This is the only work God wants from you. Believe in the one He has sent. They asked Him, What sign can you perform? Well, in this passage, people wanted to see another miraculous sign. They weren't interested in eating the bread that Jesus had given them. They wanted something new and spectacular. They wanted a show, they wanted a sign. And this tells me that sometimes we may turn to God for the wrong reasons. We may not want to come to Him because we genuinely believe He can help us. Rather, we may come to Him because we want a miracle, so that we can tell others about it. So when you come to God, make sure your heart is right. Make sure that you're coming to Him because you trust Him, not because you want a miracle to talk about. Number 8. When you trust God, you search your heart. Acts 24 verse 16. So he said, It is clear to me, King Agrippa, that you believe all the prophets. Then Paul said, I too, thank God that you believe him. But as he continued speaking, you would have me believe in Jesus, who is also called the Christ. Remember, when you trust God, you have to search your heart. You have to make sure your belief isn't based on miracles, traditions, or anything else that can cause you to waver. You have to ensure that your belief is genuine. Your belief needs to be real. Number 9. When you trust God, you face your fears. Proverbs 24 verse 10. The Lord will bring the king to grief, and he will not escape his grasp. But the righteous will have their heads lifted up at that time. When you trust God, you have to face your fears. You have to confront your fears. You have to understand your fears. For example, someone may fear poverty and start hoarding money. On the other hand, you may have someone who fears loneliness so much that they enter into abusive relationships. Another person may fear being alone, so they cling on to friendships that are detrimental. When you trust God, you have to confront these fears head on, not run from them. You have to learn to face them and overcome them, because if you don't, these fears will dictate how you live, and even what you believe. Number 10. When you don't trust God, you may feel He has abandoned you. Jonah 2 verse 4. Then I said, I have been banished from your presence. I will never again see your holy temple. Remember the story of Jonah. He was swallowed by a fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and throughout that time he prayed to God, and in his prayer, he says, I have been banished from your presence. In his mind, he felt alone, forsaken and forgotten. However, we must remember that even in these dark moments, God is still present. His love and mercy extend beyond our understanding. And finally, number 11, when you're going through hardships, it can cause you to question God's goodness. James 1 verse 2, 4. Consider it pure joy, therefore, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, since you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. Our circumstances may change, and at times our faith is tested to its limits. It's during these challenging moments that our beliefs are put to the ultimate test. It's as if God Himself steps back and asks, are you sure you trust me? Are you sure you believe I am good? And in response, we must confidently affirm, yes, Lord, I believe, you are good, and I trust in your goodness. Hardships and trials are like spiritual laboratories where our faith is refined and strengthened. They force us to confront our doubts and uncertainties head on. But as we come out of these trials, our faith emerges purer, more resilient, and unwavering. We gain a deeper appreciation for God's goodness and a stronger resolve in our trust in Him. May you always remember that God is good, even when life seems to be a constant storm. May His goodness be the anchor that holds you steady. This is chapter 5 of my reading, The Founding of Rome. As we finish up our discussion of Rome's legendary origins in Book 1 of Livy, we find that the Romans were quick to establish their religious foundations. Once they got settled in their new home, Numa Pompilius was their second king, and he was famously pious. We last saw him at the end of chapter 4, having just dedicated the temple of Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and transitions. Now though, it has time to look at how Numa built on his predecessor's foundation and established Rome's religious offices and rituals. Let's get into it. So Numa's first order of business after settling into his kingship was to establish the office of Pontifex Maximus, which translates to chief priest. This was a position that would hold great power over Roman religion for centuries. Though initially the duties of the pontifex were likely much like those of other priests, the position soon grew in importance. According to Livy, the first Pontifex Maximus was a man named Ernst Lucas, who held the position from Romulus's death in 716 until his own in 673. So he served under both the second and third kings. Livy tells us that Ernst was a Roman who had been chosen by divine inspiration, in part because he was physically imperfect, with one testicle smaller than the other. In fact, Livy comments that such physical quirks actually made someone more attractive to the Romans when it came to positions of religious authority. And it makes sense that they might have thought this way, as it seems to have been a common belief among early Romans that everything about them, even their looks or their personalities, could be read as a sign from the gods. Livy also notes that the Vestal Virgins were instituted during Numa's reign. They were the priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. And although their cult was imported from Greece, according to Livy, its origins were actually Etruscan. Either way, these women were to be virgins from the age of 6 until 30, and then they would be allowed to marry. But while they were Vestal Virgins, they were in charge of tending to the sacred fire in Vesta's temple. If that fire went out, it was seen as an ill omen, so they worked around the clock to keep it burning. They also assisted with other religious duties and were forbidden to marry. Anyone who bore a child while a Vestal Virgin was subject to severe punishment, as it was believed that Vesta's sacred fire was conceived in a similar way to how a Vestal Virgin would conceive a child. So it was clear evidence of infidelity. And this wasn't just because the Romans were puritanical, but rather because they believed that if there was any flaw in their system of maintaining piety, then there would be flaws in their relationship with the gods which would cause the Republic to fail. It's actually believed that the number of Vestal virgins in Rome fluctuated throughout history, but Livy says that under Numa there were 100 of them. Now, there were several other priest classes that Numa established. First, the flamens, or flamen, singular flamen, were priests who were dedicated to the worship of only one god. So there was the flamen Dialis, who was in charge of Jupiter, the flamen Martialis, who was in charge of Mars, and the flamen Quirinalis, who was in charge of Quirinus. Interestingly enough, each of these priests were required to be of patrician rank, which means that these cults must have been very important, as they were reserved for the most elite class of Roman society. Later on, we see that these priests had strict rules about how they should behave. For instance, they were forbidden from shaving their heads or cutting their beards, and they had to wear special clothing when performing their rituals, and that's just what we know from later periods. It's entirely possible that under Numa, these priests' duties were much less strict. As Livy points out, Numa favored quiet ceremonies, so it's unlikely that they had to shout prayers to be heard. These flamens were responsible for saying prayers, giving thanks, and making sacrifices on behalf of Rome and its citizens. It was also during Numa's reign that the Ludi Romani were said to have been established, though Livy tells us that they originated from an Etruscan festival called the Ludi Struggles. These games were a huge deal and included chariot races, musical performances, poetry readings, and theatrical reenactments. Now, again, it's likely that Numa wanted to make these games more tame, like he did with the flamens' behavior, and moved them indoors to a more civilized setting. According to Livy, Numa ordered the creation of a calendar and told the Romans to celebrate 8 days a month with religious rituals, sacrifices, or festivals. This calendar was based on the Etruscan one and divided the year into 10 months, which was pretty standard for Mediterranean cultures at the time. Later, when the Romans added 2 more months to bring their calendar in line with the lunar cycle, they placed them at the beginning of the year, January and February. But in Numa's day, March was considered the first month, followed by April, May, June, Quintilis, which later became July, August, September, October, November, and December. Livy also points out that Numa emphasized the importance of consulting the gods before undertaking any new project, and encouraged the practice of haruspicy, which was a form of divination that involved examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. The theory was that the gods would put their influence on these organs, whether through placement or markings, and the priests would interpret these signs. Now, let me just say here that this idea of Numa being a gentle, intellectual king is a bit misleading. Even though the Romans didn't seem to enjoy warfare under his leadership, doesn't mean that he was pacifistic, and many scholars believe that he instituted a form of military conscription, as well as establishing Rome's first navy. Still, he certainly had a significant impact on Roman religion. Before Numa, religion seemed to be focused mostly on war and blood sacrifice, but Numa brought a level of sophistication to Rome's religious practices that transformed it from something primarily political into something central to daily life. He created a system that ordinary Romans could work within, and it's because of this that we can know about it at all. After Numa stepped down due to old age, he left the Pontifex Maximus position to his son Tuscus and died in 673. Livy describes him as having been blessed by the gods and deified after his death, showing us that the Romans practiced a form of apotheosis, or elevating a person to godhood, similar to what happened with Romulus earlier as well as what will happen with Julius Caesar later. Okay, now that we've looked at some of the major changes that Numa implemented, let's discuss some of the other institutions and figures that formed the basis of Roman religion. First, there was the College of the 12, or the Sacerdotes Maiores, which seems to have been a group of priests who interpreted omens and advised the king on matters of religion. Under Numa, this group expanded to include 20 members, but they always numbered between 12 and 24 the rest of Roman history. They were influential, as their position gave them access to the king, but they weren't exactly the highest-ranking priests. That distinction belonged to the Rex Sacrorum, or king of the sacred rites. This position was hereditary and tasked with supervising the other priests and ensuring that they performed their rituals correctly. Then there were the Vestal virgins, as we discussed earlier, and their primary duty was tending to Vesta's sacred fire. There was also a separate group of priestesses called the Epoptae who assisted the Vestals in their tasks. Then there were the Augurs, whose main duty was to interpret the will of the gods by observing signs in nature, particularly the flight patterns of birds. You may have noticed that many of these priests were responsible for watching fires, and there was good reason for this. As the Romans associated fire with the divine realm, the same was true of the Arvel Brethren, who were 30 priests in charge of overseeing agricultural rituals and propitiating the spirits of the fields, as well as celebrating the festival called the Ludi Romani. And finally, we need to discuss the Flaminia, as they were especially important in Roman religion. We already mentioned the 3 Flamen who were in charge of the major gods, Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. But there were also 2 groups of Flamen, the Flamen Quirinus and the Flamen Augustals, who were established later to serve the imperial cult. Other types of Flamen included the Flamen of Terminus, who protected boundaries, and the Flamen of the Augustals, who assisted the Rexarch. And that's just about everyone. Now you might be wondering where Livy got all this information about Roman religion. Well, he was drawing from a work called the Antiquitates Romanae, written by a guy named Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Unfortunately, that work is lost, but luckily for us, there are still plenty of sources to reconstruct what Roman religion was like in its earliest days. What we see here is a system full of offices and responsibilities, but it never feels too burdened. Part of that is because many of these duties were passed off to lower-ranking priests and priestesses, but it also seems to have been a conscious effort by Numa to remove himself from the picture as much as possible. He wants to start a dynasty, and the best way to do that is to make sure that no one else wants to be king. After him, he accomplished that by spreading the wealth and creating a bunch of jobs. The downside of this, of course, is that we don't hear anything about the accomplishments of most of these early priests. So for now, we're going to move on to our next king and leave them behind. But that doesn't mean they're not important. After all, their legacy is what led to the highly organized religion that we associate with the Roman Empire. Thanks for watching. Chapter 6: The Sacred Calendar and Festivals. Rome was built by shepherds. It was then expanded into an agricultural town. Then it became the capital of a vast empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. And throughout these various stages, the Romans never forgot their roots. They were farmers at heart. Even when they ruled distant provinces, they returned home to tend to their fields every summer. And when winter came around, bringing with it the prospect of meager harvests, they celebrated the season's bounty with joyous festivals. For Rome was a city that knew how to honor both work and leisure. But most importantly, for a city so deeply concerned with order and organization, it was a city that also knew how to live in step with the cycles of nature. The bedrock of this system was Numa's creation of a structured calendar with religious festivals and days of rest interwoven throughout the year. This is one of those moments where it would be easy to get bogged down in dates and names. So instead of just giving you the long list, I want to take you through what life might have been like if you were born in ancient Rome. If you are interested in learning more about Roman history in depth, we've put together a series of articles that you can read free on our website. The link is provided below. Let's say you were born a Roman citizen during the Republic. Your father's family name is Brutus, which means stern or hard. Your mother's family name is Cornelia, which means horn. You will grow up knowing that your destiny is to marry another Roman and raise children, perhaps even destined to serve in the military or hold political office someday. Life as a Roman man or woman is simple but with responsibilities. Every day you will complete tasks necessary for survival, tending to your crops or working in your shop, making sure there's enough food for the next meal, caring for family members. But while you're doing all of this, you'll also be participating in a much larger system, because Numa's calendar is built on 2 types of days: fasti, lawful days, and nefasti days, reserved for the gods. Every fasti was a good day because it was suitable for business, legal proceedings, and making important decisions. Every nefasti was a bad day because it could bring ruin if anyone did any business, legal proceedings, or made any important decisions. So as a Roman living your daily life, you had to pay attention to what day it was before starting any new task. If you were born in March, you would know that today is the feast of Neptune, god of the sea, so maybe you stay out of the water today. Or if it was the 9th of May, you would unschedule an important meeting today, because this was the day that Romulus killed his twin brother Remus, after the 2 of them fought over who should rule the city of Rome. It's not a fun story, and it's certainly not a good omen. These nefati were days when everything stopped. There were no business transactions, no court hearings, no weddings, funerals, or even military campaigns. These days were sacred because the gods were believed to be particularly active then, either moving among mortals or holding their own mysterious meetings. This is how you would learn about time as a Roman. Time was sacred. Time was powerful. Time was divine. Just like the moon phases, the seasons changed and the world was reborn again and again. The dry earth drank in the rains, then sprouted green shoots, bloomed into summertime abundance, then withered again before the rains returned. The Romans took these seasonal turns as signs from the gods. Each festival was linked to the cycle of nature, reminding everyone of the rhythms of the cosmos and their place within them. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about some of these festivals. Saturnalia was a celebration of agriculture and the return of the harvest. Lupercalia honored the she-wolf that nursed Romulus and Remus after they were abandoned as infants, and the festival of Floralia was dedicated to flowers and included a parade of women holding flower-laden baskets. But perhaps the most important of all these festivals was the festival of the Ludi Romani. It was the largest and oldest of Rome's many festivals, lasting 7 days in September. Every year, it was a celebration of the founding of the city and the Roman state. All the people of Rome came together to celebrate their patron deity, their common origins, and their civic duty. It was a huge public event with athletic competitions, theatrical performances, processions, and banquets. So these were the days that you looked forward to as a Roman. Days filled with games and parties, a chance to show off your skills and win glory for yourself and your family. And there were also days that brought the community together, not only to honor the gods, but also to remind themselves why they came together as a community in the first place, because they were citizens of Rome. That sense of belonging, of being part of something greater than themselves, bound the Romans together and helped them endure the hardships of life. Numa's calendar gave the Romans rhythm, it gave them peace, it gave them a connection to the divine. When you think about it, the calendar we use today does exactly the same things. We schedule important meetings on certain days, days that carry weight and meaning. We take time off on weekends to spend time with family or catch up on sleep. We even use the Gregorian calendar to determine which days are most likely to see thunderstorms, hurricanes, and snowstorms. Our calendar may have been refined over the centuries by scientists and astronomers, but it still serves the same basic function as Numa's calendar. It reminds us that we are part of something larger than ourselves. If you grew up in the modern world, like me, you probably do want to remember learning about months named for dead Roman emperors or deities who presided over obscure aspects of Roman life. You might not even know what a fasti or nefati was. But if you're like me, you learned the months of the year by reciting them in order: January, February, March, and so on. And now, those months shape your life, whether you realize it or not. That's the legacy of the Roman calendar. It's a legacy that's shaped Western civilization for almost 2,000 years. And it's a legacy that continues to shape the lives of billions of people today. Now, before you go, I want to say thank you for watching this video. I'm here, and this is a presentation in partnership with a company. We share a passion for bringing the ancient world to life for modern audiences, and we hope that you've enjoyed this series. Now it's bedtime. I'm about to show you how the Romans made wine. In this next video, we're going to look at 4 different ways that Romans got drunk. The ancients really liked their drink. Wine flowed freely at banquets. Soldiers drank to get drunk. Slaves mixed drinks for their masters. Prostitutes plied their trade in taverns and brothels, and you can bet that the Romans liked it strong. We'll be looking at the infamous Roman pot of mixed drinks called maltsum, but don't worry, it's not too late to stop drinking. Click here to watch this other video about ancient gladiators. See you tomorrow. This is part 7 in our series on Livy's history of Rome. We are slowly approaching the Republic, but there is still some important history to cover, so let's just get started. As we begin this chapter, Livy reminds us that every good thing that has happened to Rome can be traced back to good laws. He says that all of Rome's achievements in war were based on its laws concerning military service, voting, elections, contracts, treaties, and criminal trials. And he goes on to say that the best kings contributed to these laws, but none more than Numa. So now it's time to talk about Numa's laws, and Livy tells us there are 2 main things they were based on. The first was fairness, and the second was piety. And by piety, Livy means religion and worship of the gods. So let's start with contracts. Numa established the formal weights and measures that were to be used throughout Italy. These were bronze weights, and they came in sets of different sizes for use with different size transactions. This is a pretty interesting detail because it shows that Numa wasn't just thinking about Rome, he was thinking about all of Italy. His goal was to bring peace and prosperity to all of them. He then established rules for business contracts, like how both parties had to agree to the deal for it to be binding, and also how witnesses had to be present for larger deals. Now, why do these things matter? They matter because they created a stable economic environment. People could go into business knowing that they would be treated fairly, that their contracts would be honored, and that any disputes would be settled according to a fair set of rules. Property rights were another major concern for Numa. He understood that people had to feel safe in their homes and secure in their possessions, so he made laws to protect the right of citizens to own property and to pass it on to their heirs. Marriage was another important institution for Numa. He saw it as the foundation of the family and the state, so he made laws to regulate marriage, like requiring that both men and women be of marriageable age and that the bride's father give his consent to the match. Now, this may seem like a small thing, but it's actually huge. Marrying outside of one's social class was relatively common in Rome, and so this law protected young women from being forced into unwanted marriages. In fact, Livy points out that this was the first law that really restricted the power of fathers over their daughters. But that's not all. Numa also made it a crime to take a wife away from her husband. This might seem obvious, but it wasn't in most of the ancient world. Most states didn't protect women from being taken away from their husbands by force or fraud, but Numa did, and this was a big deal. It meant that Roman women could be confident that they would not be taken from their husbands unless they wanted to go. And then there were the oaths. Romans made all kinds of oaths, and Numa wanted them to be taken seriously. He made it a crime to break an oath, and he also made it a crime to force someone else to break their oath. He also made it a capital offense to accuse someone falsely of breaking an oath. Breaking an oath was such a serious matter, because it was considered a crime against the gods. The gods were the witnesses of oaths, and those who broke their oaths were said to have incurred the wrath of the gods. Numa took these matters very seriously, and so did the Romans. For centuries, the breaking of an oath was considered one of the worst crimes imaginable. Now, all of these things were important, but they wouldn't work if there wasn't a way to enforce them. And that's where Numa's other great contribution to Roman law came in. The courts. Numa established the first courts in Rome, and he staffed them with judges who were trained in law. These judges were responsible for hearing cases and deciding them according to the law. This was a big deal. Before Numa's courts, disputes were often settled by force or by appeals to popular opinion. But Numa wanted to create a more rational system, a system based on law and evidence rather than force or emotion. Now, it's important to note here that Roman law was not based on the concept of natural law. Natural law is the idea that there are certain rights that all people have simply because they are human beings. For example, the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. Roman law didn't have these rights, but it did have a number of other important principles. One of these was the presumption of innocence. In Roman law, a person was considered innocent until proven guilty. This was a big deal because in many other cultures, people were considered guilty until they could prove their innocence. Another important principle of Roman law was that everyone was equal before the law. It didn't matter if you were a king or a pauper, you were equal under the law. This was another big deal because in many other cultures, the rich and powerful were above the law. Now, there were some flaws in Roman law, of course. For example, women were not equal to men under the law. They could not vote, they could not hold public office, and they could not own property in their own name. But these were the conventions of the ancient world, and it's important to remember that Rome did change over time. Women eventually got the right to vote and hold public office. And while they still couldn't own property in their own name, they did have more rights than women in most other societies. In addition to establishing courts, Numa also made other important contributions to the development of Roman law. He established the first law of evidence, which required that evidence be relevant and reliable. He also established the first rules of procedure, which ensured that both sides had a chance to be heard. And he even established the first legal dictionary, which defined the meaning of important legal terms. So what was the legacy of all this? Well, it was enormous. Numa's legal reforms laid the foundation for the Roman legal system, which would become one of the most sophisticated legal systems in the ancient world. In fact, many historians argue that it was the Roman legal system that preserved the continuity of Western civilization. When Rome fell, many of its legal ideas survived and influenced the development of law in Europe and America. Okay, so enough about laws already. What was everyday life like during Numa's reign? Actually, that's a great question because this is a good place to look at the difference between Numa and Romulus. Romulus was a warrior king, and he ruled with the force and violence that was necessary to hold together a newly founded settlement. He made decisions quickly and decisively. He punished people severely for crimes, and he went to war whenever he thought it was necessary. But Numa was different. He was a peaceful king, and he tried to avoid violence whenever possible. He didn't punish people harshly, and he preferred to settle disputes peacefully. In fact, sometimes his opponents accused him of being too soft. Let me give you an example of this. There was a dispute between the Luperci and the Quirites over the possession of some sacred ground. Now the Luperci were a powerful group, and they had a lot of support from the common people. But the Quirites were a wealthy and influential group, and they had a lot of support from the Senate, so it looked like this was going to be a violent dispute. The two sides were so evenly matched that it looked like there would be bloodshed. Now, most kings would have sided with one group or the other. They would have used their power to enforce a decision, but not Numa. Instead, he brought the two groups together and forced them to settle the dispute peacefully. He didn't care who won, as long as there was no violence, and you know what? They agreed to share the land. Now that might sound like a cop-out, but it wasn't. This was a brilliant solution. It avoided violence, and it kept the peace. That was what mattered to Numa. There was another incident that showed Numa's commitment to peace. A delegation from the Sabines came to Rome to complain about the Romans' mistreatment of their women. You see, the Romans had a custom of kidnapping Sabine women, and they were mistreated. The Sabines demanded that the women be returned, but when the Romans refused, they threatened war. Now, again, most kings would have just gone to war. It would have been easier to fight the Sabines than to try to negotiate with them. But Numa didn't do that. He sent back the women and then he married one of them. That's right. The guy we've been calling Creepy Uncle Rome. Chill. He even had a daughter with her, and that's how chapter 7 ends. If you want to know what happened next, well, you'll just have to watch chapter 8. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below to let me know what you think. Also, if you want to help me make these videos better, please consider becoming a patron. Your support would mean a lot. Alright, so chapter 8, Temples, Shrines, and Sacred Symbols. We've been marching through ancient Rome at night with Livia and her companions, and now we're going to be seeing some of the most important religious sites of Rome. It is said that there were about 300 temples in Rome at this time, so let's go check some of them out. We start off with Numa's temples because he was a devotee of many of the Italian gods. He built a temple for Janus, the god of transitions and doorways, whose statue had two faces looking in opposite directions, and since Numa wanted peace, he kept the doors of the temple shut. That became a symbol of Rome's not belligerence. Now, normally, the doors of the temple would be open during war and then closed when peace was made, but Numa always kept them closed. In fact, this was the only temple in Rome where sacrifices were not made in the morning, they were made in the evening instead. There was also a small shrine of Janus in the adjacent courtyard, which could have its own priestess or priest. Right beside the temple of Janus was the temple of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and home. She was one of the most venerated goddesses of Roman religion. Her priests were called Vestal virgins. They were young women who were taken from their families and dedicated to Vesta. They lived communally, and had many rules they had to follow. If they broke the rules, they were buried alive. You know what? It's probably best if we don't visit the Vestal virgins right now. Let's just move on. Next up is the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, the chief of the gods. This temple was the largest in Rome, and it was also the most important. When it was destroyed by fire, it was considered a disaster. The citizens believed that it happened because they had neglected Jupiter. The third time it burned down, though they decided to blame it on a Christian. Numa also built a temple for the Lares household gods, and for the Pinites gods of the storehouses. These were both very important deities because the Romans believed that the Lares gave health and prosperity to the family, and that the Pinites protected their food supply. The Romans believed that their gods were very interested in human affairs. They believed that the gods helped them in every aspect of their lives. For example, before they went on a journey, they would pray to the Lares for protection. They believed that the Lares guided their steps and kept them safe. Similarly, before they ate, they would pray to the Pinites for a blessing on their food. They believed that the Pinites made sure that their food was pure and free from harm. Okay, we can move on now. It's time to talk about some of the symbols of Rome's divine protection. First up are the sacred shields of Mars. These shields, called Anchylia, were said to have fallen from the sky during the Battle of the Alban Mount. They were discovered by shepherds and presented to Romulus, the founder of Rome. Once Romulus saw them, he knew that they were sacred and set aside the first shield as a trophy. Every year, on March, during the celebration of the anniversary of the founding of Rome, the other shields were used by the priests of Mars in a procession around the city. The shields were also decorated with the heads of Medusa and other monsters that symbolized the defeat of chaos and represented the triumph of order. These shields weren't just symbols of Rome's military power, they were also symbols of the city's rebirth. They reminded the Romans of how they had overcome their enemies and established their own civilization. This story of the shields being sent from the gods was a way of giving legitimacy to Romulus's rule. By claiming that the shields had come from the gods, Romulus was saying that he had been chosen by the gods to be the king of Rome. This was a common way for ancient leaders to legitimize their power. They would often claim that they had been chosen by the gods to rule, and they would use symbols and rituals to reinforce this claim. And speaking of symbols and rituals, the next one we need to talk about is the Salii priesthood. Their name comes from the Latin word salire, which means to leap, and that's exactly what they did during their sacred dance, the so-called saltation. They would leap and dance around the Lupercal cave, where it was believed that Romulus and Remus had been nursed to health by a she-wolf. During their dance, they shook rattles made from the thigh bones of warriors captured in battle. These rattles were called tintinnabulae, and they were said to have been given to the Soliers by the god Mars. The Salii were an order of priests who were responsible for protecting Rome from fire and other disasters. They were also supposed to ensure that the Tiber River did not overflow its banks. The Salii believed that they could control the weather by performing certain rituals. For example, if it was summer and there was no rain, they would hold a ceremony called an evocatio, where they would call upon the gods to bring rain. They also held a festival called the Lupercalia in honor of the she-wolf that nursed Romulus and Remus. But let's talk about the symbolism here. Okay, the she-wolf was a symbol of the wildness of Italy before Rome was founded. The Sali's duty was to keep the wolf at bay and prevent it from destroying the city. They also used torches in their rituals. The torch was a symbol of light and life. It represented the Roman people and the city itself. The Salii carried torches during their processions, and they used them to drive away evil spirits. The torch was also a symbol of the Olympic flame. The Soliers were one of the oldest and most important priesthoods in Rome. They were present at every major Roman festival, and they played a key role in many of Rome's most important rituals. Now let's move on to another important symbol of Rome's divine protection, the Capitoline wolf. This bronze sculpture depicts the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus. It was commissioned by the Roman dictator Sylla and placed on top of the Temple of Rome and the twin brothers. Romulus and Remus were the legendary founders of Rome. According to legend, they were raised by a she-wolf after their mother, the goddess Rhea Silvia, was abandoned on a riverbank. Eventually, they returned to their human family, but they soon got into a fight over who should be the king of Rome. Romulus killed Remus and became the first king of Rome. The Capitoline wolf is a symbol of Rome's origins and its connection to the natural world. It represents the idea that the Romans were not just a civilized people, but also a wild and untamed one. It was also a symbol of the power of family and the importance of community. It was said that in times of war, the wolf would lick the hands of those who dipped their bread in blood. That doesn't sound very appetizing. We'll move on to the last one now. The Romans believed that their gods were everywhere, not just in the temples. They believed that the gods were in the natural world around them. For example, they believed that the gods were in the trees and the mountains. They also believed that the gods were in the animals that lived in the natural world. This belief led to the Romans to have a special reverence for certain animals. For example, they believed that the bull was sacred to Jupiter. They also believed that the eagle was sacred to Jupiter and that the wolf was sacred to the twin gods, Romulus and Remus. Because of this belief, the Romans did not kill these animals. They also believed that the gods were in the inanimate objects in the natural world. For example, they believed that the gods were in the rivers and the lakes. They also believed that the gods were in the rocks and the soil. Because of this belief, the Romans did not disturb the rivers, lakes, rocks, and soil. They also believed that the gods were in the stars and the planets. They believed that the gods were in the sun and the moon. Because of this belief, the Romans used the stars and planets to tell the future. They also believed that the gods were in the past, present, and future. They believed that the gods were in the birth, death, and rebirth. Because of this belief, the Romans believed that the gods were in everything and everyone. So guys, thank you for coming on this little tour of ancient Rome at night. I hope you enjoyed seeing some of the most important religious sites of Rome and learning about some of the symbols of divine protection that the Romans believed were everywhere. Don't forget to stay tuned for more videos about ancient Rome. And until then, remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was built by people who really believed in their gods and their symbols. I'll see you next time. Well, hello there, and welcome to Chapter 9. So if you're following along at home with the series, you may have noticed that we are getting close to the end. In fact, this is it for the main storyline. and I can only say that I hope you have enjoyed coming along on this journey so far. The purpose of this series has been to try to show what life was like under the rule of Augustus, and how his principate laid the foundations for the Pax Romana, which would last for 2 centuries. We've looked at politics and power, at war and administration, economy and society. And now, finally, we come to the legacy of this age. How did Augustus change Rome forever? Well, that is what we are going to try to answer today, so let's get into it. So first off, let's start with the big one. We've talked about Augustus's military campaigns in previous episodes, but here I want to focus on what was perhaps even more remarkable than all the victories he achieved, and that was the fact that during his entire reign of 40 years, there was not a single day of war. That might seem strange for Rome, right? Because Rome was a warrior culture. Rome was built on war, and throughout its history, there had never been more than a few decades without some kind of conflict. But during Augustus's reign, there were no wars. Not only that, but he made sure that none of the provinces revolted either. Now, mind you, that isn't to say that everything was perfect and that it was an age of total peace. There were rebellions among the Germanic tribes, and Augustus had to put them down. But the fact that these conflicts were settled without civil war was something altogether new. And it allowed Rome to grow stronger because it meant that resources could be devoted to public works projects, infrastructure, farming, trade, instead of being squandered on the endless costs of war. Augustus recognized how important this was, and he took every opportunity to remind people of the fact that he had brought Rome peace. You can see this everywhere in the art and literature of the period. He is shown holding a scepter or a branch of victory, or he is standing next to altars dedicated to the goddess of peace. Now, why is this significant? Well, I mean, peace is good. Obviously, it allows society to flourish and grow in ways that are not possible during times of war. But the significance of peace was even more profound for Rome, because peace allowed Rome to grow in a way that was true to itself. See, up until Augustus, Rome had grown through war, conquering new lands and taking prisoners, and then either killing or enslaving them, or resettling them as subjects. War had shaped Rome from the very beginning. It was in Rome's DNA. But Augustus believed that Rome should grow in a different way, not by taking land from others, but by providing for the needs of her own people. He established colonies for veterans and settled dispossessed farmers on public lands. He launched massive public works programs to build roads and aqueducts and temples and public buildings, and he created jobs for thousands of people who might otherwise have been unemployed. This wasn't just about making sure that Rome was prepared for war. This was about building a better life for ordinary Romans, and in doing so, he made Rome stronger. Stability at home and peace abroad meant that Rome did not have to spend vast sums maintaining an army or conquering new lands. Instead, they could devote their energies to growing the prosperity of the empire, and the result was a Rome that was more prosperous and more secure than ever before. His successor Tiberius would later boast that he had inherited an empire that was totally unprepared for war, and he had to spend the first 5 years of his rule simply bringing it up to strength again. That tells you just how much Augustus had accomplished during his reign. But there is another reason why Augustus's reign was so significant, and that is that his influence extended far beyond his own lifetime. Rome's identity was reshaped during this age in such a way that its effects could be felt for centuries to come, and that is because Augustus was able to establish 3 pillars of strength for the Roman state: law, religion, and order. Under Augustus, Roman law became a cohesive whole. He established legal codes that applied equally to all subjects in the empire, regardless of where they lived. He also reformed the courts and the system of jurisprudence, which would make it possible for future generations of Roman jurists to compile and refine Roman law. Then there is religion. During Augustus's reign, a new state cult was created in his honor, and while this was initially resisted by the Senate, it eventually became accepted practice to deify the emperor upon his death. That, of course, would have huge implications for the future, since it meant that emperors could now be seen as divine, and that would lead to all sorts of problems later on. But in the early years of the empire, it was seen as a way to ensure the prosperity and stability of the state. Finally, there is the matter of order. Augustus reorganized the entire administrative structure of Rome. He introduced accounting rules and record-keeping, and he kept a tight hold on the reins of power. He understood that the secret to success lay in maintaining order, both at home and abroad, and he went to great lengths to make sure that Rome was always ready for any eventuality. Now, those 3 things: law, religion, and order would be the defining characteristics of the Roman Empire for centuries to come. Roman law would serve as the foundation for many modern legal systems. Roman religion would influence the development of Christianity, and the Roman emphasis on order and discipline would shape the entire political culture of the Western world. In other words, Augustus's legacy was enormous. He reshaped Rome in such a way that the effects could be felt for centuries to come, and I think that's because Augustus understood something very important about the nature of power. Power isn't just about brute force, it's also about creating a vision and inspiring people to follow it. Augustus wasn't just a soldier or a conqueror. He was a statesman, an administrator, a reformer. He had a vision for Rome, and he worked tirelessly to bring it to reality. He didn't just seize power, he earned it, and in doing so, he created a legacy that would outlive him. It's hard to overstate just how profound an impact Augustus had on the development of Western civilization. His reign was a watershed moment, a turning point that marked the beginning of a new era. He laid the foundations for the Pax Romana, which would bring to centuries of peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean world. He reshaped Roman society and established a new order that would last for centuries, and he inspired countless writers, artists, and thinkers who came after him. So, Augustus, he might not have been the greatest general or the most brilliant strategist, but he was undoubtedly one of the greatest leaders in history, and that is why he is remembered as the man who built Rome, and thus concludes our series on the rise of the Roman Empire. As I mentioned, this has been a really fun series to research and write. I hope you have enjoyed watching it as much as I have enjoyed making it. If you did, please be sure to leave me a like and a comment to let me know what you thought. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you. In any case, I hope you will continue to tune in for more content, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Until then, Vale. The founding king of Rome is dead, and in chapter 10 we're gonna find out what happens next. If you need a recap, don't worry, because here's one from the top. In about 753 BCE, there was a little boy named Numa. He didn't want to be king, but his dad, the previous king, had recently died, and so it fell to him. Fortunately for Numa, he was very smart, and even though he was young and unsure of himself, he wasn't alone. His father left him an awesome teacher named Tags, who was like a super wise mentor until the day that he died. Also, the goddess Minerva came down from Olympus just to hang out with Numa and help him out while he was king. Basically, through the aid of a good teacher and the favor of the gods, Numa became a great king. Now, being a good ruler meant doing stuff that Numa would normally never have the guts to do. For example, he led the Romans in war against the Etruscans, defeating their army at the river Crimera. This was no big deal because Numa didn't actually enjoy violence. In fact, he was totally opposed to it. He got all hot and bothered about killing people. So after this victory, Numa decided to chill out in his palace and never go to war again. The thing is, now that Rome was technically at peace, they were free to expand. So over the next few decades, Numa gained lots of land around central Italy. Now, this was still not done through military conquest. Rather, he sent representatives to these neighboring cities and told them like, hey, you should totally become friends with us. Now, if they said yes, then Numa would confirm them as kings and establish an alliance. But if they said no, well, it turns out Numa was a huge fan of divine retribution. Like when a Sabine king named Titus Tatius turned down his offer of friendship, Numa invoked the god of the underworld, Pluto, to curse him with infertility. Or when the Latins rejected Roman rule, Numa invoked the goddess of discord, Eris, to sow strife among them. But Numa's true glory came in the realm of religion and law. First, he built a bunch of temples to the major Olympians, establishing cults of worship that would survive for centuries. And second, he created a legal code that everyone had to follow. It was basically the first constitution of Rome. He laid out the structure of the entire government, including the Senate, and created a bunch of new religious holidays like the Lupercalia festival and the Floralia flower festival. Now, all of this was great, but Numa didn't do it just for the prestige. No, his real motivation was achieving inner peace. Numa wanted to harmonize the city of Rome with the rhythms of the cosmos. He thought that the key to a successful empire was maintaining good relations with the gods. And if the humans in his kingdom followed the laws and respected the rituals, then the divine powers would smile upon them and grant them prosperity. Sadly, Numa wouldn't live to see how successful his system was. After about 40 years as king, the gods took him away from this world and placed him up on Mount Olympus. But before we say goodbye to our boy, let's take a moment to recap why he was so dang cool. Now, obviously, Numa stands out as a great leader because he chose peace over war. Sure, he fought the Etruscans, but after that he bailed on violence entirely. Instead, he reached out to other Italian city-states and made them into allies. And he also gave them self-rule as long as they paid tribute to Rome. Now this was not only a smart way to grow Rome's power, but it was also a morally good strategy, because no one was enslaved or subjugated. This allowed the Roman Empire to be more stable and prosperous, because there was less revolts and more trade. Plus, later on, the practice of sending representatives to other cities would evolve into the Roman Senate, which was basically the most powerful governing body in the entire Mediterranean. Now, in terms of religion, Numa was kind of like the Thomas Jefferson of ancient Rome. Jefferson famously said that he could not imagine a separation of church and state because to him, government was a religious institution, and Numa felt the same way. He established cults to the major Olympians, but he also appointed priests and priestesses to oversee the ceremonies and rituals. He created new festivals to celebrate the seasons and the harvest, and he even put together a manual called the Leges Numae, which outlined the duties of each priest and priestess. Now later on, this manual would be lost, but its influence lived on in books like the extremely popular 12 Caesars of Rome, and those books told stories about the origins of Roman religion and its heroes. So by establishing these religious practices, Numa solidified his dynasty and helped make Rome the powerhouse of the Mediterranean. Finally, Numa's lasting legacy can be seen in the development of Roman law. Before Numa, Roman society was mostly governed by tradition and custom, but he changed all that with his creation of the Leges Numae, which was a written set of laws that everyone had to follow. Like seriously, this was the first constitution of Rome. It outlined the duties of each magistrate, regulated business transactions, and established procedures for things like divorce. Now, sure, it wasn't perfect, but it was a big step forward for Roman civilization. And the best part was that Numa wanted to make it accessible to everyone, you see. Along with creating the Leges Numae, he also opened the Senate to all male citizens and created courts to hear civil cases. This helped make Rome a more orderly and peaceful place. So now that we've recapped everything that Numa did, let's think about it. What was he? I mean, obviously he was a great king, but beyond that, what was the secret to his success? Well, to answer that question, let's compare him to his brother, Romulus. Remember him? Yeah, he was the other founder of Rome, the one who killed all his twin brothers on the Palatine Hill, and he's the reason that Rome is considered the most violent city in the world. Seriously, go back and listen to episode 6 if you need a refresher. The point is, there are two ways to found a city, through war and pillage or through religion and law. Romulus went with the sword and fire, but Numa went with the plow and the gavel. One founded an empire, the other founded a nation. One pursued fame and glory, the other pursued peace and harmony. And the difference between these two approaches is the difference between a warrior and a lawgiver, between passion and intellect, between chaos and order. Now, personally, I lean towards the side of harmony and peace, but I know plenty of people will disagree with me. They'll say that law and order stifle creativity and that violence is necessary for progress. But the truth is, it doesn't have to be either or. We can learn from both Romulus and Numa, because both paths have their pros and cons. So now it's time for soft closing thoughts. As I look back on the history of Rome, I'm struck by the importance of ritual and ceremony in human life. From Romulus suckling on the she-wolf to Numa building a temple to Minerva, rituals connect us to something bigger than ourselves. Whether it's the gods or our ancestors or the community as a whole, they give us a sense of belonging and identity. They also bring order to chaos. Think about all the times in your life when you had to follow a specific set of steps to achieve a certain outcome. Getting married, getting a driver's license, starting a business. These are all examples of rituals that help us navigate the complexities of adult life. And even in our most intimate relationships, rituals play an important role. Saying I love you for the first time, proposing, exchanging vows. These are all moments when we use specific words or actions to express our deepest feelings. Now some people might think that rituals are just silly or meaningless, but I disagree. I think they're incredibly powerful. They give us a way to mark the passage of time and the changing of seasons. They provide a sense of continuity and stability in an ever-changing world. And they allow us to express our creativity through music, art, and drama. As I drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to think about the rituals in your own life. What do they mean to you? How do they shape your identity and your relationships? And what new rituals might you want to create? And that's the end of the series. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please consider supporting the podcast. And if you have any feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. I appreciate all the love and support. Okay, class dismissed. Go forth and spread the Numism.